They gave her a clipboard and called her ma'am, with the kind of condescension reserved for civilian auditors. They saw a geologist in a place meant for soldiers, a soft variable in a hard equation. What they failed to see was the predator who had made the very ground beneath their feet her hunting domain, a creature who understood the slow violence of stone and the deep, resonant secrets of the earth. By the time they understood her purpose, the mountain had already chosen its master, and it was not the man with the stripes on his sleeve, but the quiet woman who listened to its bones. Listening post-Erebus was a tomb buried a kilometer deep in the granite heart of the Tannhauser Range. The peaks above were knives of obsidian and ice, a contested borderland where satellites feared to tread, and drones were swatted from the sky by competing electronic warfare suites. Down here, in the cold, sterile silence, the war was fought differently. It was a war of whispers, of tectonic tremors and acoustic signatures read from the strain gauges and geophones embedded in the mountain's core. The air, scrubbed and recycled until it was thin and sharp, tasted of ozone from the server racks and the faint metallic tang of chilled water weeping through microfractures in the cavern walls. Silence was the natural state, a coiled thing that made the hum of the facility's life support seem like a roar. It was a place designed to listen to the planet's subtle shifts, and in doing so, to the clandestine movements of the enemy who burrowed and built on the other side of the ridge. Dr. Eris Thorne stood before the primary holographic display, a three-dimensional, ghostly blue representation of the mountain's internal architecture. She was a still point in the humming ballet of data feeds and diagnostic routines. Her fatigues were a sterile gray, devoid of any rank, unit patch, or name. They were functional, anonymous, and fit her slender frame in a way that suggested utility over regulation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, pale in the glow of the hologram, was a mask of intense, unadorned concentration. Her fingers moved not on a keyboard, but through the air, manipulating the glowing model with deft, precise gestures. She traced a faint hairline fracture line that snaked its way through the K2 stratum, a layer of metamorphic schist 700 meters below their position. To the others in the command center, it was just another line of data, a geological artifact. To Eris, it was a sentence in a language she alone could read. Her focus was a physical presence in the room. She didn't just see the data, she perceived its texture, its implications. The subharmonic tremors emanating from the fault were too regular, too rhythmic. Nature was chaotic, a symphony of random stresses and releases. This was different. This was a metronome ticking deep within the rock, a pulse where none should exist. She could feel the pressure building along the fault line, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated not in her ears, but in the marrow of her bones. It was the feeling of a bowstring being drawn slowly, inexorably taut. The mountain was being tuned, and she knew, with a certainty that transcended data, that it was not a natural process. She was watching the enemy prepare an instrument of immense destruction, and the instrument was the very ground that gave them shelter. She adjusted the gain on the deep core resonance sensors, her movements economical and fluid, her mind already mapping the potential energy release, calculating the cascade of failures that would follow if that string were to be plucked. The doors to the command center hissed open, a violent slash of sound that tore the fabric of the room's deep quiet. Master Sergeant Rex Gunner entered as if he were breaching a hostile structure. He was a large man, built of thick muscle and immovable certainty. His decorated uniform stretched taut across his chest. His voice, when it came, was a blunt instrument, designed to hammer down dissent and impose order through sheer volume. Status report. I want to know why half my seismic alerts are being rerouted through this science fair. He planted his boots on the polished concrete floor, a deliberate, aggressive stance that claimed the space as his. His eyes, small and hard, swept the room, dismissing the technicians at their consoles before landing on the anonymous woman in gray. Gunner's presence was a disruption of the facility's delicate ecosystem. He moved with the heavy tread of a man who believed the world was a nail, and he was the only hammer. The air, once cool and analytical, now seemed to crackle with his abrasive energy. He strode past a bank of servers, his hand brushing a conduit with careless disdain. A young corporal, monitoring the atmospheric scrubbers, flinched as Gunner's voice echoed off the rock walls. The master sergeant was a creature of the surface world, of explosions and direct action. Down here, in the domain of patience and subtle interpretation, he was a foreign body, an infection of noise and bluster in a world of profound silence. He saw the complex array of sensors and holographic displays not as instruments of a deeper warfare, but as distractions, expensive toys for the eggheads that command had saddled him with. His gaze fixed on Eris. He walked over to her station, deliberately placing himself between her and the holographic display, a crude assertion of physical dominance. He peered at the glowing blue lines, his expression a mask of bored contempt. "And what exactly is this supposed to be, ma'am?" The word ma'am was delivered with a particular edge, a blend of forced protocol and undisguised condescension. It was the title one gave to a civilian contractor, a tourist in the serious business of war. He was categorizing her, putting her in a box labeled irrelevant. Eris did not turn. She did not acknowledge his physical presence. Her attention remained locked on the K2 stratum, where the subharmonic pulse had just intensified by a fractional yet deeply alarming degree. She made a minute adjustment to the holographic model, her fingers phasing through the light, isolating the tremor's point of origin. Gunner waited for a response, his jaw tightening as the silence stretched. He was a man accustomed to immediate deference. This quiet, focused dismissal was a greater slight than any argument. He saw it as insubordination, a failure to recognize the hierarchy that was the bedrock of his entire existence. "I asked you a question, Doctor," he growled, the honorific now dripping with sarcasm. He gestured vaguely at the complex data streams flowing across a secondary monitor. "My men are responsible for the security of this facility. That means I need to know what every person in here is doing, especially when they're playing with lights instead of watching the perimeter sensors." He was framing her work as a game, a childish distraction from the real work of soldiers. He was drawing a line in the sand, his world of tangible threats versus her world of abstract data. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her console. "Look, I'm sure all this is very fascinating back at some university lab, but this is an active combat zone. Down here, we have a chain of command. We have protocols, and I don't see any rank on your collar." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl meant to be heard by the nearby technicians, an act of public humiliation. "In my world, ma'am, if you don't have stripes or bars on you, you fetch the coffee. Now what is your function here?" The challenge was laid bare. It was not a request for information. It was a demand for submission. He was testing her, trying to force her to acknowledge his authority, to break her composure and reduce her to another subordinate. Now she moved. It was a slow, deliberate turn of her head, not her body. Her eyes, a cool and startling gray, met his for the first time. They were utterly devoid of emotion, not fear, not anger, not even annoyance. It was the calm, analytical gaze of a scientist observing a particularly loud and predictable chemical reaction. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and clear, a striking contrast to his percussive boom. It carried no inflection, no deference, and no aggression. It was the voice of pure information. "Subharmonic tremor, vector 271, she stated, her gaze shifting back to the hologram. "Correlates with a stress increase of 0.8 gigapascals in the K2 stratum. The frequency is 14.2 hertz. It is not natural." Her response landed in the charged air of the command center with the weight of a drop stone. It was a complete and total refusal to engage with his power play. She had not explained herself. She had not justified her presence. She had not acknowledged his rank or his challenge. She had simply stated a fact, a piece of data from her world that was, in its quiet and terrible significance, 1,000 times more important than his entire tirade. She had answered his question about her function not with a title or a job description, but with a demonstration of it. The act of analysis was her function. Gunnar was left standing in the vacuum of her dismissal. He had thrown a punch and hit nothing but air. The nearby technicians, who had been pretending not to listen, were now studiously focused on their screens, but the tension was palpable. He had been publicly nullified, not by a counter-challenge, but by sheer, indifferent competence. His face flushed a dark, mottled red. He opened his mouth to retort, to reassert his dominance with another blast of volume, to demand she address him properly. He never got the chance. A low, gut-wrenching groan vibrated up from the concrete floor, a sound that seemed to come from the center of the earth itself. It was the sound of 1 billion tons of rock being stretched past its breaking point. Before the sound had even registered, the world lurched sideways. A violent, concussive wave slammed through the facility, throwing men from their chairs and shattering monitor screens. The lights flickered, died, and then came back on under the crimson glare of emergency power. A cacophony of alarms shrieked through the air. Structural integrity failures, atmospheric breaches, seismic event warnings, all screaming at once. The holographic display in front of Eris wavered, then stabilized. The blue mountain now overlaid with a spiderweb of angry red lines. The K2 stratum was glowing with a furious, pulsing energy. The metronome had stopped ticking. The bowstring had been released. This was not an earthquake. An earthquake was a release, a chaotic exhalation of pressure. This was an attack. It was a focused, directed application of force, a seismic hammer blow delivered with tactical precision. The enemy hadn't tried to drill down to them. They had weaponized the mountain itself. They had found the resonant frequency Aris had been tracking and amplified it, turning the very rock that was meant to protect listening post Erebus into a cage and then a coffin. Dust and grit rained down from the ceiling, and the deep, grinding protest of stressed rock was now the only sound beneath the wail of the alarms. The main blast doors at the end of the primary access tunnel groaned, the meter-thick titanium alloy screaming as it was warped in its housing. A fine web of cracks appeared on the reinforced concrete wall next to it. A report crackled over the internal comms, the voice of a soldier choked with dust and panic. "Tunnel 1 is gone. Complete collapse. We're sealed in. They were trapped. In the crimson-lit chaos, Gunnar found his footing. This, at last, was a world he understood. This was a crisis of physical barriers and immediate action. The abstract data on the screens was now irrelevant, replaced by the brutal reality of 1,000 meters of rock pressing in on all sides. He was a soldier again, not a confused bureaucrat. His voice boomed, cutting through the fear. "All right, settle down. Damage control teams, report. Chen, get your engineers. I want breaching charges on the Tunnel 1 blockage. We blow our way out now." He was defaulting to the only solution he knew: overwhelming force. Protocol demanded they secure the area and then establish an escape route. To him, the blockage was just another locked door, and his key was C4. It was a simple, direct, and utterly wrong solution. He was trying to punch his way out of a landslide, blind to the fact that his punch would only bring more of the mountain down upon them. His orders were loud, clear, and based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the battlefield. He saw the rock as an obstacle. He did not see that the rock itself was now the weapon. Corporal Chen, a young combat engineer with a sharp, intelligent face, scrambled to his feet, grabbing his kit. Yet he hesitated. His eyes flickered from Gunnar to the main structural integrity display, which showed terrifying new stress fractures forming in the rock around the collapsed tunnel. His training was screaming at him to obey the Master Sergeant's orders, but his instincts, and the data, were screaming that it was suicide. To detonate a powerful explosive in a geologically unstable environment that had just been subjected to a massive, directed energy attack was unthinkable. It was like trying to put out a grease fire with a bucket of gasoline. He looked at Gunnar, his mouth half open to voice his concern, but the Master Sergeant's face was a mask of furious determination. Dissent, in that moment, was not an option. It was then that Aris moved from her station. She walked calmly through the panicked room, her steps steady on the vibrating deck. The red emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, making the scene feel like a descent into hell. She stopped beside Corporal Chen, her gaze fixed not on Gunnar, but on the structural display. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality of absolute stillness that cut through the alarms and the shouting. Negative. It was a single word, delivered with the flat, final authority of a physical law. Gunnar spun around, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "What did you say?" he roared, striding toward her. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" Aris didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply pointed a steady hand at her own holographic display, which she had wirelessly slaved to the large wall screen. The image of the mountain reappeared, but now it was a dynamic simulation. A small, bright point of light, representing Gunnar's proposed explosive charge, flashed near the tunnel collapse. Instantly, the shockwave propagated outwards, not in a simple sphere, but along the newly formed stress lines, the ones Aris had been studying. The energy didn't dissipate. It fed into the resonant frequency the enemy had used. The K2 stratum, already primed and vibrating with stored energy, flashed white. A sympathetic cascade reaction tore through the entire mountain base. On the screen, the schematic of Listening Post Erebus was crushed, erased in a silent, elegant implosion of red lines. The simulation was horrifyingly clear. Gunnar's plan wouldn't just fail to clear a path, it would trigger a total structural collapse. The entire facility would be annihilated in seconds. "Detonating conventional explosives," Aris said, her voice still unnervingly calm, We'll introduce a broad-spectrum shockwave into a critically excited medium. You won't just clear the tunnel, you will trigger a sympathetic resonance cascade. The schist in the K2 stratum will undergo liquefaction. We will be buried under a kilometer of superheated, pulverized rock. She paused, letting the clinical, terrifying words sink in. She then looked directly at Gunnar, her gray eyes like chips of flint. "The mountain told me." The command center fell into a sudden, profound silence. The alarm still shrieked, but they seemed distant, secondary to the raw, intellectual power of her statement. She had not argued with Gunnar. She had not challenged his rank. She had simply shown him the physics of his own extinction. Authority in that moment began a seismic shift of its own. It started to flow away from the man with the stripes and toward the woman who understood the language of their tomb. Corporal Chen stared at the simulation, his face pale. He was an engineer. He understood wave propagation, material stress, and harmonic frequencies. He saw the terrifying logic in her model. It was not a guess. It was a calculation. It was the truth. He slowly lowered the breaching charge he was holding, placing it gently on the deck. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but firm, not looking at Gunnar but at the screen. "She's right. The shockwave propagation, the constructive interference along the existing fracture planes, it matches her model. It would be instantaneous." That was the first crack. Chen's validation, coming from one of his own men, a specialist in the relevant field, was a critical blow to Gunnar's authority. Other soldiers, who had been moving to follow his orders, now hesitated. They looked from the master sergeant's furious face to the calm, certain posture of the woman in gray, and then to the terrifying simulation of their own deaths. The chain of command was breaking, superseded by the more primal chain of survival. Gunnar stood alone in the center of the room, his orders ignored, his power evaporating into the dust-filled air. His entire worldview, built on a foundation of rank and protocol, was crumbling beneath him. He was a master of a game that was no longer being played. Aris became the new center of gravity in the room. She did not seize command. It was ceded to her, moment by moment, by the silent, fearful consensus of the crew. They looked to her, their faces asking the question that Gunnar was too proud to voice. "What do we do?" She turned away from the master sergeant, her dismissal of him now absolute and final. He was no longer a factor in the equation. Her attention was on the problem, on the mountain. She manipulated the holographic display, peeling away layers of rock, searching for a new variable, a different path. "The enemy used a focused, resonant frequency to cause the collapse," she said, her voice a calm narrative in the midst of the ongoing crisis. "They tuned their weapon to the mountain's weaknesses. It was an elegant, brutal piece of engineering. Brute force is the wrong response. We cannot force the lock. We must find another key." Her fingers danced through the hologram, highlighting a different part of the deep Earth schematic. A thin, almost invisible line, a natural geological fault, snaked its way upwards from a point not far from their position. It was a capillary, not an artery. "Here," she said, zooming in, "a leucogranite dike. An igneous intrusion. It's harder, more crystalline than the surrounding schist. The primary shockwave was reflected around it. The fault line along its edge is stable." She traced its path. "It intersects with the primary ventilation shaft system at grid reference 9-4-gamma. The shaft leads to the surface." A flicker of hope went through the room. Chen stepped forward. "Ma'am, that fissure is less than 30 centimeters wide. We can't get through that." Not yet, Aris replied, her expression unchanged. A new set of calculations began scrolling on her screen, complex equations governing wave mechanics and material plasticity. The enemy gave us a lesson in harmonic resonance. We will apply it. She turned to Chen, her voice now crisp with command. Corporal, I need you and your engineers. We are going to repurpose the facility's seismic survey emitters. We will not use them to listen. We will use them to speak. The plan she laid out was both insane and brilliant. It was a piece of geological surgery on a gargantuan scale. They couldn't use a single, powerful explosion. Instead, she proposed using a series of precisely controlled, high-frequency acoustic pulses, fired from the survey emitters embedded in the facility's foundations. These pulses, tuned to the resonant frequency of the leucogranite dike itself, would not shatter the rock. They would make it vibrate. The goal was to create a sustained, controlled harmonic vibration that would cause the softer schist around the dike to crumble and flake away, widening the fissure, not with a bang, but with a carefully directed hum. It was like using an opera singer's voice to shatter a wine glass, but the wine glass was a fault line a kilometer underground, and the voice was a multi-megawatt seismic emitter. Gunnar, who had been watching in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "That is the most insane thing I have ever heard," he sputtered. "You're going to bring the whole mountain down on us with your rock music." Aris didn't even grant him a glance. "The alternative," she stated flatly, "is to wait here and suffocate, or follow your plan and be vaporized. The choice is not complicated." She turned to Chen, who was already looking at her with a dawning awe. "Corporal, I need the emitters calibrated to a base frequency of 73.4 Hz, with a peak power output of 2 megawatts, pulsed at intervals of 1.7 seconds. Route all non-essential power to their capacitors. I will give you the precise firing coordinates. You will execute on my command." "Yes, ma'am," Chen said, without a moment's hesitation. The transfer of authority was complete. He and his team moved with a renewed sense of purpose, not because a sergeant had yelled at them, but because they had been given a plan that was rooted in logic, however terrifying it might be. They were no longer victims waiting for the end. They were participants in a desperate, elegant gambit. The next hour was a symphony of controlled chaos, conducted by the quiet woman in gray. Aris stood at her console, her focus absolute. She was no longer just a geologist. She was a fire control officer, a surgeon, and a virtuoso playing an instrument the size of a mountain. She directed Chen's team with a stream of calm, precise commands, giving them power levels, frequency modulations, and firing vectors. Emitter 1, adjust angle to 14.8 degrees. Emitter 3, increase power to 90%. Stand by to fire pulse sequence alpha. The first pulse went out, a deep, subsonic thrum that vibrated through the soles of their boots. It was a sound felt more than heard. On the holographic display, a wave of energy, visible only to her instruments, shot through the rock and impacted the fault line. A shower of dust fell from the command center ceiling. A collective gasp went through the room. They were deliberately shaking their own cage. "Hold," Aris commanded. She watched the return data, analyzing the rock's response. "The schist is fracturing as predicted. The dike is stable. It's working." She paused, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "There's a secondary resonance building at a higher harmonic. We need to counteract it. Chen, prepare a counterpulse on emitter 2. Frequency 146.8 Hz, 20% power." Gunnar could do nothing but watch. He was a relic, a man whose skills were utterly useless in this new reality. His authority was gone, his pride shattered. He stood by the wall, a powerless observer, as the woman he had tried to humiliate orchestrated their potential salvation with a language he could not comprehend. He saw the looks on his soldiers' faces as they worked, the focused intensity they gave to her every command. They trusted her. In the space of 30 minutes, she had completely undone his years of leadership. The process was agonizingly slow. Pulse after pulse was sent into the rock, a delicate, terrifying conversation of vibrations. The mountain groaned and shifted around them. At one point, a large chunk of rock broke free from the ceiling in a nearby corridor with a deafening crash, sending a tremor through the facility. For a heart-stopping moment, they thought the end had come. But Eris's voice cut through the fear, steady and certain. That was expected, a stress release from the upper strata. The target fissure remained stable. Continue the sequence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she fell silent. The emitters powered down. The deep thrumming ceased. The only sound was the ever-present shriek of the alarms and the ragged breathing of the people in the room. Eris stared at her screen, where a new sensor feed was coming online. It was from a micro-drone Chen had sent into the nearest air duct. "Chen," she said, her voice quiet. "Report." The corporal was hunched over his own console, piloting the tiny drone. "I'm approaching the intersection. I see it. Holy." His voice trailed off. On the main screen, the drone's camera feed appeared. It showed a dark, narrow opening in the side of the ventilation shaft, an opening that hadn't been there before. A steady, cool draft of air was blowing out of it, stirring the dust motes in the drone's light. It was a jagged, ugly wound in the rock, but it was wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was a way out. A wave of stunned, breathless relief washed through the command center. They had done it. Her impossible, insane plan had worked. A profound silence descended, a moment of shared awe where the crew simply absorbed the reality of their salvation. They were alive because of the quiet woman they had ignored, the auditor their master sergeant had mocked. They looked at her not just with respect, but with a kind of primal reverence. She had not just saved them, she had bent the world to her will. It was in that moment of quiet triumph that a new sound emerged, faint and distorted. A crackle of static from the long-range comms panel, a system that had been completely jammed since the attack. A green light flickered to life. A voice, filtered through layers of interference, but clear and impossibly calm, filled the room. "Erebus Actual, this is Trident Command. We registered a counter-resonance signature and a subsequent atmospheric pressure change at your location. Report status. Over." The voice was steel, calm, and authoritative, a clear signal from the world above. Gunnar, jolted back to some semblance of his former self, instinctively moved toward the comms panel. It was his duty as the ranking NCO to respond. He was a master sergeant. He reported to command. He reached for the handset, his mouth opening to deliver a standard situation report. But the voice from the speaker cut him off before he could speak, the tone shifting from inquiry to a direct order. "Negative, Erebus. Stand by. I want a direct link to Commander Thorne. Now." A dead, perfect silence fell over the command center. It was heavier than the rock, more profound than the quiet between seismic pulses. Every single person in the room froze. The name hung in the air, an impossible, legendary word. Commander Thorne. The soldiers exchanged shocked, disbelieving glances. They slowly, as one, turned their heads to look at the unassuming woman in the plain gray fatigues, who was still calmly watching the data feeds on her console. Gunner's hand, which had been reaching for the comms handset, stopped in midair. His face, already pale with stress and humiliation, went the color of bleached bone. Every drop of blood seemed to drain from it. The name resonated with him, not from a duty roster, but from the hushed, almost mythical stories traded in spec war briefing rooms. Thorn, the ghost of the Hindu Kush, a phantom operator who didn't lead SEAL teams on raids, but taught them how to turn the environment itself into a weapon. A geophysicist with a doctorate from MIT and a trident on her chest. A legend who was said to have stopped an enemy tunnel network by triggering a localized precision earthquake. A commander whose rank was so specialized and whose missions were so classified that she operated outside the normal chain of command. A ghost in the military machine. He looked at Eris, at her calm posture, her unassuming clothes, her utter lack of insignia, and he finally understood. It wasn't that she lacked rank. It was that her rank was so far beyond his, so far outside his simplistic understanding of hierarchy, that it was invisible to him. He had not been talking down to a civilian scientist. He had been trying to order a Navy SEAL commander to fetch him coffee. The sheer, soul-crushing weight of his arrogance, his stupidity, crashed down on him. His entire world, built on the visible, tangible symbols of authority, had been a lie. Eris turned from her console. She walked to the comms panel, took the handset from its cradle, and pressed the transmit button. Her voice was as flat and factual as it had been all along. "Trident, this is Erebus," she said, the name Erebus now sounding like her own call sign. "We have a structural breach due to a hostile resonant weapon. The weapon has been neutralized using a facility-level counter-application. We are evacuating all personnel via a tertiary egress route. No casualties." She paused for a fraction of a second. "Master Sergeant Gunner's on-site command is under review for compromising operational safety with reckless adherence to outdated protocols." Her judgment was delivered without anger or triumph. It was a clinical assessment, a simple statement of fact, which made it all the more devastating. She wasn't punishing him. She was merely logging his failure. With that single, calm transmission, she had erased his career. He visibly deflated, the last of his bluster and pride vanishing, leaving behind a hollowed-out man in a uniform that suddenly looked too big for him. The evacuation began. They moved in a single, orderly file through the dark, narrow passage she had opened for them. The air was cold and fresh, smelling of deep earth and distant snow. No one spoke. The only sounds were the scuff of boots on rock and the occasional clink of equipment. Eris led the way, not because she ordered it, but because the path naturally cleared for her. The soldiers who had once looked through her now averted their eyes, their expressions a mixture of awe and a deep, profound fear. They gave her a wide berth, as if she were a source of some fundamental dangerous power they could not comprehend. They had witnessed a miracle of science and will, and they did not know how to act in the presence of its architect. Gunner was at the very back of the line, a ghost himself now, stripped of his voice and his authority. He moved like an automaton, his eyes fixed on the ground, a broken man being led out of his own tomb. The hierarchy of the listening post had not just been broken, it had been inverted. The old order, based on rank and volume, had been shattered and replaced by a new one, based on the silent, undeniable reality of competence. As they neared the ventilation shaft, Corporal Chen jogged forward, his steps quiet and hesitant. He caught up to Eris, but he kept a respectful distance. He didn't offer congratulations or thanks. He understood, on some instinctive level, that such things were meaningless to her. Instead, he held out his hand. In his palm was a small, crystalline piece of rock, a shard of the leucogranite dike that had been dislodged during the resonance sequence. It glinted in the beam of his headlamp, a complex lattice of dark and light minerals. "Ma'am," he began, then corrected himself, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "Commander, what is this?" It was the ultimate gesture of respect. He wasn't praising her victory. He was asking to understand her methods. He was acknowledging her as a teacher, a master of a craft he had only just glimpsed. It was a request to learn, a recognition that her knowledge was the truest form of power in that mountain. Eris stopped and took the rock from him. She turned it over in her gloved fingers, her analytical gaze softening for just a moment. She saw not just a stone, but a story, a history written in pressure and time. "Garnet pyroxenite," she said, her voice holding a trace of something that might have been warmth. "It's a piece of the upper mantle." The weapon's resonance wave was so powerful, it created a kimberlite pipe effect, bringing deep earth material to the surface. "It's rare to see a sample this pure." She handed it back to him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" They emerged one by one from a grated opening onto a high, windswept ledge. The night was shockingly cold, and the sky was a spray of hard, brilliant stars, a sight so vast and open it was disorienting after the crushing confinement below. In the distance, the rhythmic thumping of rescue helicopter blades grew steadily louder. Their ordeal was over. The soldiers huddled together, a small group of survivors on the edge of the world, but Eris stood apart. She walked to the edge of the precipice, her slight form silhouetted against the immense, jagged peaks of the Tannhauser Range. She looked back at the mountain, not as a conqueror, but as one who had engaged in a difficult and intimate dialogue. She had listened to its complaints, felt its pain, and then had spoken back to it in its own language of frequency and vibration. The sergeant had learned a hard lesson that night, buried under a kilometer of his own ignorance. He had believed that authority was a thing you wore on your sleeve, a currency of loud commands and visible insignia. He had failed to understand that in a true crisis, real authority is not a rank to be claimed, but a current that flows inexorably toward competence. He had tried to command the mountain's master, a foolish man shouting at the sea. Dr. Eris Thorne, Commander, United States Navy SEALs, had never needed to raise her voice. She had no need for the superficial trappings of power. She spoke the mountain's language, and when it mattered most, the mountain and the men trapped within it had answered. Her purpose fulfilled, she waited for her ride, a silent ghost ready to disappear back into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but a legend and a widened fissure deep in the heart of the stone.